How do you make a super wide angle photo when you don't have a lens that's wide enough? I'm going to tell you how to do it on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there everybody, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. If you've got a photo question, you know what to do by now. You just go to askdavidbergman.com and submit that form right there on the site. I just might pick your question and answer right here on a future show. It's right now the end of 2023, and I just finished my Shoot from the Pit live concert photography workshops for the year. There were 37 dates in 16 countries this year alone, and I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who came out all around the world. If you're curious about future workshops and you want to join me out on the road sometime soon, sign up for the free email list at shootfromthepit.com, and you'll be the first to know when new dates and cities are announced. In the meantime, Tony K attended one of my workshops this year, and then he sent in this question. Hey David, at your awesome Shoot from the Pit in Amsterdam, you showed us a super wide angle shot of yours at a stadium. When I asked how you pulled it off, you said you stitched together multiple images. Please enlighten us on how to do this. Many thanks. Well, thank you, Tony. We really didn't have enough time at the workshop to go over this particular technique, so I'm glad you sent in the question. First, let me tell everyone what we're talking about. Now, there may be times when you want to make a really wide angle shot, but you might not have the right lens with you. Now, I own the Canon RF 15 to 35mm f2.8 lens, and 15mm is pretty wide. Canon also just announced the RF 10mm to 20mm zoom, and I can't wait to get my hands on that lens because it's going to give me an even wider field of view without the distortion of a fisheye lens. Now, when I shoot concerts, I like to put the 15 to 35 on my EOS R5, and I use it as a remote camera that I leave on the stage all night long during the show. I also carry a couple of lenses on my shoulders on two R3 bodies. Now those are either going to be the 24 to 70 and the 70 to 200 if I need a 2.8 aperture, or the 24 to 105 and the 100 500 if I've got a lot of light to work with and don't need to shoot at 2.8. Either way, at every show, I like to go all the way up to the very top of the arena or the stadium to make a really big wide shot showing the entire place. I think it's an important part of the story to show what that looks like. Of course, it's impressive if it's 50,000 people at a stadium for a Luke Combs concert, but even if it's just your friend's band playing in a club in front of 10 people or so, it's still cool to show that. I think it's important. To get 10 people to come out and spend their money to see your friend's band playing is a big deal. And one day, if they're playing in front of 50,000 people, you'll be happy to have pictures when they were only playing in front of 10. Anyway, because my 15 to 35 is usually up on the stage, I can't get to it, and the widest lens that I have with me only zooms out to 24mm. Sometimes that is wide enough depending on the angle that I'm shooting, but I often find myself wishing that I could go even wider. So that's when I'll make a multi-shot panorama. Now I have a lot of experience doing these. You may have seen one I did way back in 2009 at President Obama's inauguration. I used a robotic camera mount called the Gigapan. Now that device allowed me to shoot hundreds of overlapping photos and then stitch them together in the computer to make one very high resolution image. My inauguration photo went viral because you could zoom in and see nearly every one of the 2 million people in the crowd that day on the mall in Washington, D.C. Now, I went on to make Gigapans at a bunch of big sporting events like the Super Bowl, the World Series, and the Olympics. But by shooting a series of overlapping photos, the thing is, I'm not actually confined by the focal length of my lens. That's because I can capture parts of the scene that are outside the field of view that you'd normally see. Now these days, I'm mostly on tour photographing concerts. It's not usually possible or practical to shoot hundreds of photos like I did at the inauguration. But that's okay because I'm not doing it to get high resolution images like I did with the Gigapan. This isn't about zooming in to see faces. It's just about getting a wider field of view. So I can do that by manually shooting anywhere from 6 to 10 images, more or less, depending on what you're doing and depending on that particular scene. But whether you're shooting 8 or 800 images, the general idea is still the same. You shoot overlapping images and then stitch them together in the computer after the fact. Now I'm going to give you a few tips on how to make the best panoramas possible. Now first, what you need to do is decide if you're just going to do a single row of images across or multiple rows up and down. When I'm working quickly at a concert, I prefer to just keep it to one single row. For that, I'm going to turn my camera vertically or in the portrait orientation. That's so I can get more height in my final image. If you stay horizontal and you shoot across that way, your final image is going to be really long and narrow, and I think that's a little bit too much. I'd rather give myself more space than I think I'm going to need, and then I can always crop it after the fact. Now, if you're using something like the Gigapan where you're going to do multiple rows above and below, then horizontal might just be fine since you'll have some height from those extra rows. Now, as far as camera settings, the main thing to remember is that this has to look like one cohesive image, even though each frame is taken at a separate moment in time. So all of your photos have to be consistent. That means you should shoot on manual exposure so the brightness doesn't change as you're shooting all of these images. You also shouldn't change your focus, so depending on how you shoot, you might need to go into manual focus mode or just make sure to lock your focus. I shoot using back button focus, so I simply pre-focus on what I want, then let go of that back button and my focus won't change as I shoot. You also need to pay attention to what's happening as you're shooting. It can actually be tricky during a concert because the lighting is changing constantly. If you watch what the lighting is doing and you shoot quickly, you can possibly get all of your images in roughly the same lighting conditions. Now, I've had plenty of times, though, where I'm working my way across the scene and then there's a dramatic change in the light. That's going to look weird when you try to stitch it. So I'll either wait for the light to go back to where it was when I started, or I'll just go back and start again with the new light. Either way, no matter what type of event you're shooting, because you're taking a series of images over time, you just need to pay attention to things like that. When I did Gigapans at the World Series, for example, I always made sure that none of the players were in the final image more than once. It's quite possible that I'd capture players in the outfield, and then by the time I photographed the dugouts all the way on the infield, the inning may have ended and those same players are waiting for their turn at bat. So they'd be in the picture twice. I always wanted the final image to be as realistic as possible, so I'd either get the whole thing done in a half an inning as fast as I could, or more often than not, I'd wait until the next inning when those players were back in the same position again. Of course, this is going to be less of an issue with landscape photos where there are no people, and if you're only doing a handful of images where the viewer can't really zoom in to see individual people anyway, then I wouldn't worry about it too much. Now, as far as how to move the camera, in a perfect world, you'd be doing this on a tripod and you'd rotate the camera using specialized hardware. If you're doing a pano with hundreds of images, I definitely suggest taking the time to do it that way. But practically speaking, if you're at an event like a concert and you just need a quick wide shot, you're going to be working without any of that stuff. If possible, though, when you move the camera in between frames, don't just hold it out in front of you and move from side to side. That's never going to work really well. There's actually a spot in your lens, in the middle of that lens, where the light rays converge. Where the light comes in, they converge, and then they go on to hit the sensor. And rotating your camera on that particular point is going to correct for what's called parallax. Now, without going down too deep of a rabbit hole, parallax is simply just how the foreground and background seem to change position relative to each other when you move the camera. If you can find what's called the nodal point on your lens, and that actually may be a good topic for another video if someone sends in that question, it's going to make for a much better stitch of the final image. Even if you don't know exactly where the nodal point is, it's better to just pretend like there's a stick coming up through the middle of your lens and rotate the camera on that, right? That's basically where your nodal point is. If you can figure out where that is, usually somewhere in the middle of your lens, and rotate the camera on that point instead of moving like this, it's going to work out much better in the final stitch. Now, having said that, this really isn't as important if you don't have something close up in the foreground against a background that's much further away. If you're basically just shooting a flat plane, then, like a wide shot at a concert, then I wouldn't stress too much about it, and the stitch is still going to come out pretty nicely. The other thing is that you have to give yourself enough overlap on each image so that the stitching software can figure out how to match up those frames. I try to overlap each frame about 25 or 30%. Just make sure that whatever is in the far end of one frame, when you move to the next frame, you can still see that on the other end of the next frame, if that makes sense. Keep doing that as you continue to shoot, and you should be just fine. Now, as for what focal length to use, again, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish and how much time you have. If you want super high resolution and you have the time to shoot hundreds of images, then go ahead and use a very long focal length, like 200 millimeters. You'll be zoomed in so tight that you'll have to shoot a lot of images to cover the entire area. The more images you shoot and then stitch together, the higher the resolution of the final panorama. For my concert pictures, like I said, I don't need that much resolution, and I want to get all of the frames photographed quickly before the light changes. Anything I shoot will be higher resolution than a single frame because it's going to be multiple images. But it's really just about getting a wider field of view. So I'll often do them at 24 millimeters. Turned vertically, I usually make 7 or 8 frames across. And remember to shoot more frames than you think you'll need. Make sure you get on both ends. And then you can always crop it in post. I'd rather have too much information than not enough. The final step after you've captured all these images is just to stitch them together. I still shoot raw, and then I work on the individual frames before exporting them as JPEGs. Then I bring those JPEGs into software that's made for combining images. There are a lot of options out there, and new programs come out all the time. If you own or subscribe to Photoshop, then you already have one called Photo Merge. It's a pretty simple function that's built into Photoshop and allows you to select the images, and then it stitches them together. It does a pretty good job, but I've found it can have trouble with some things like repeating patterns and dark areas. My current favorite software that works really well is called PTGUI. That's PTGUI. It's a powerful program that allows you to stitch either just a few images or hundreds if you need to. I find that it just works great with my concert panoramas, and I can be in and out of the program really quickly. That's actually my goal. I don't want to spend any more time on the computer than I have to. Then you just bring that new pano. Once it's all stitched together, bring that into your photo editor of choice. I use Capture One, but any of the programs like Lightroom or Photoshop will work fine. You can edit your image if you want, but hopefully it won't need too much if you did your original raw conversions carefully. I crop the photo after it's stitched, so I have the exact final field of view that I want. So that's it. That's really how you create a super wide panorama. If you don't have a lens that's wide enough, shoot a series of overlapping images that cover an even wider area. But remember, creating a panorama is half science and half art. Get your camera settings right, but don't forget basic composition rules to make a really cool image. Look at what the final image is going to be, plan it out so it's a cool photo first, then go ahead and zoom in and make those individual images and stitch them together to make a really killer panorama. Have you ever made a wide-angle panorama? How did you do it, and how did it turn out? Let me know down in the comments below. Remember, you can send in your own photo questions by going to askdavidbergman.com and filling out that form. If you're not already a subscriber to the Adorama YouTube channel, go ahead and click the subscribe button, hit that little bell icon so you're notified of all the new shows that come out all week long from myself and the other hosts right here on Adorama TV. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope you'll come back next time when I'll have another question to answer right here on Ask David Bergman.